The first thing people noticed about Willow Creek Ranch was its silence.
We need a full
It wasn't the
statement
kind of
before you leave.
silence that felt empty or lonely. It was the kind that carried peace in every passing breeze and rested comfortably between the rustling leaves of century-old oak trees. Stretching across nearly 400 acres just outside the growing suburbs, the ranch had remained untouched by the hurried pace of modern development. It stood as a reminder that some places were worth preserving, not because of their price, but because of their history. For nearly 70 years, Willow Creek Ranch had belonged to one family. Long before expensive neighborhoods began surrounding its borders, before luxury homes replaced farmland throughout the county, the property had been built through sacrifice and perseverance. 3 generations had planted its trees, repaired its fences, and protected its traditions. Every stone pathway and weathered wooden gate carried memories that money could never replace. Its current owner, 68-year-old Samuel Harper, understood that better than anyone. Samuel was not the kind of wealthy landowner people imagined when they heard someone owned hundreds of acres of land. He drove an aging pickup truck that had seen better days, wore faded work clothes that smelled faintly of cedar and fresh-cut hay, and spent most mornings repairing something around the property himself. Few strangers would ever guess that the quiet man they occasionally passed in town owned one of the most valuable pieces of land in the county. That misunderstanding suited Samuel perfectly. Years earlier, wealthy developers had begun approaching him with increasingly generous offers to purchase his family's ranch. They promised luxurious communities, shopping centers, and millions of dollars if he would simply agree to sell. Samuel refused every single offer. Money had never been the reason Willow Creek existed, and it would never become the reason it disappeared. His refusal had become something of a local legend. Developers came and went. Investors grew frustrated. Real estate agents called repeatedly before eventually giving up. Through it all, Samuel remained exactly the same man he had always been. Quiet, patient, unmovable. The only significant change had arrived 5 years earlier, when construction began on an exclusive gated community bordering nearly 2 miles of his property. The development marketed itself as luxury living surrounded by nature. Ironically, much of the nature advertised in its brochures consisted of photographs taken near Samuel's ranch. Its residents paid enormous HOA fees in exchange for private security patrols, manicured landscaping, and exclusive amenities. For many of its newer homeowners, the distinction between the development's boundaries and Samuel's property had gradually become blurred. Some residents began behaving as though their expensive homes entitled them to authority over everything surrounding their neighborhood. Samuel had encountered the occasional complaint over the years. Someone objected to the sound of his tractors during harvest season. Others complained that his horses occasionally wandered near fencing visible from their properties. Once, an HOA representative demanded he remove an old wooden barn because it negatively affected nearby property values. Samuel politely reminded them that the barn had existed longer than the entire neighborhood. That conversation ended quickly. For the most part, however, the two worlds existed peacefully beside one another. Samuel respected his neighbor's privacy and expected the same courtesy in return. Until one Tuesday morning changed everything. It began like every other day at Willow Creek Ranch. The sun had barely risen over the eastern hills when Samuel walked toward his favorite section of fencing near the southern entrance of his property. A recent storm had loosened several fence posts, and he intended to repair them before the afternoon heat arrived. The southern entrance wasn't used frequently. It consisted of a gravel road leading through a large wooden gate bearing nothing more than a small brass plaque engraved with the words Harper Family Ranch, established 1957. There was no elaborate signage or security checkpoint. There didn't need to be. Everyone in town knew who owned the property. As Samuel approached the gate carrying his tools, something immediately caught his attention. Parked directly across the entrance was a black SUV displaying magnetic decals reading Community Patrol Services in large gold lettering. Two men wearing matching black uniforms stood near his gate holding clipboards while speaking animatedly with one another. Samuel slowed his pace. He knew every member of the county sheriff's department and immediately recognized that these men weren't affiliated with any legitimate law enforcement agency. Their uniforms appeared designed to imitate authority without actually representing it. More concerning was the temporary metal sign they had placed beside his entrance. Private community access restricted. Authorized RSID&TS only. Samuel stopped walking and quietly read the sign twice to make certain he wasn't misunderstanding what he was seeing. Someone had blocked access to his property and claimed authority over land they did not own. He wasn't angry yet. Mostly he was confused. The men noticed him approaching and immediately straightened their posture. One of them appeared to be in his 40s, while the younger man couldn't have been older than 25. Their expressions suggested complete confidence in whatever authority they believed they possessed. Samuel offered them a polite nod as he approached. The older man spoke first, though his tone carried more command than courtesy. He immediately began treating Samuel as though he were an employee or groundskeeper rather than the property's owner. Without introducing himself or asking questions, he informed Samuel that access through the entrance had been temporarily suspended pending community review procedures. Samuel listened quietly while the man explained that neighboring homeowners had submitted complaints regarding increased traffic, livestock concerns, and property maintenance issues affecting community standards. The explanation grew increasingly absurd with every passing moment. The younger patrol officer eventually added that their organization had been authorized to enforce community regulations, extending beyond the neighborhood's immediate boundaries whenever residents' interests were involved. Samuel patiently waited for them to finish speaking. Then he calmly informed them that they were standing on private property and politely requested that they remove their sign and leave immediately. Neither man appeared particularly concerned by his request. Instead, they exchanged amused expressions before explaining that property matters would be addressed through appropriate HOA channels and that unauthorized individuals could not simply disregard community policies. The irony of informing a man that he could not access his own property seemed completely lost on them. Samuel had experienced enough of life to recognize arrogance when he encountered it. He also understood that arguing with people determined to misunderstand rarely accomplished anything productive. For 70 years, his family had taught an important lesson that Samuel never forgot. When someone willingly reveals their character, patience often reveals everything else. So rather than becoming angry, Samuel repeated his request politely. He warned them that they had no legal authority whatsoever over his land, and advised them to leave before they created serious problems for themselves. Again, they refused. What Samuel didn't know was that this encounter represented only the beginning of something much larger. The two men weren't acting independently. They had been hired by several influential HOA board members who had quietly grown frustrated with Samuel's continued refusal to accommodate their demands over recent years. Together, they had convinced themselves that enough pressure might finally persuade the elderly ranch owner to become more cooperative. After all, they assumed he was simply an old farmer unfamiliar with property law and reluctant to challenge organized authority. Their greatest mistake wasn't trespassing onto Willow Creek Ranch. It was underestimating the man standing before them. Because Samuel Harper wasn't merely protecting inherited land. He had spent 40 years practicing property law before retiring to manage his family's ranch full-time. And by refusing to leave his property after being warned, the fake HOA patrol had unknowingly chosen the worst possible landowner in the entire county to intimidate. Their lesson was only beginning. Samuel Harper had learned many things during his 40 years practicing property law, but one lesson had followed him throughout his entire career. People rarely created their biggest problems because they lacked intelligence. More often, they created them because they possessed too much confidence and too little humility. Standing beside the southern gate of Willow Creek Ranch, Samuel immediately recognized both qualities in the men before him. They weren't criminals in the traditional sense. They weren't thieves attempting to steal equipment or vandals damaging private property. In their minds, they were representatives of authority carrying out instructions from people wealthier and more influential than themselves. That made the situation far more dangerous. People acting maliciously usually knew they were breaking the rules. People acting arrogantly often believed the rules simply didn't apply to them. The older patrol officer continued writing notes on his clipboard, while casually informing Samuel that community concerns would remain their priority regardless of individual objections. His tone suggested he was generously explaining policies to someone who simply didn't understand them. Samuel found himself almost feeling sorry for him. Almost. For decades, Samuel had sat inside courtrooms watching similar situations unfold. Someone convinced themselves that enough confidence could substitute for legal authority. Someone else assumed their position or title entitled them to ignore established boundaries. Eventually, reality arrived carrying consequences nobody expected. Reality was always patient. Samuel quietly looked toward the temporary metal sign standing beside his gate. Someone had spent money manufacturing it. Someone had approved placing it there. Someone had authorized private security personnel to physically restrict access to land belonging to another person. That wasn't merely arrogance. That was planning. He realized immediately this situation extended far beyond two men standing beside his entrance. Someone within the neighboring community genuinely believed they possessed authority over Willow Creek Ranch. That misunderstanding was about to become extraordinarily expensive. Samuel politely informed the patrol officers one final time that they were trespassing and asked them to remove their vehicle and sign immediately. He explained that refusing to do so after receiving notice would significantly complicate matters moving forward. The younger officer simply smiled politely before responding with the kind of rehearsed confidence Samuel had heard thousands of times throughout his legal career. People who believe they're protected by someone else's authority rarely appreciate how quickly that protection disappears when consequences arrive. Samuel nodded quietly before setting his toolbox beside the fence post he had originally intended to repair. There was no anger visible in his expression. No raised voice or frustrated gestures accompanied his response. Instead, he reached into his pocket and made 2 phone calls. The first lasted less than 30 seconds. The second lasted slightly longer. Then he returned his phone to his pocket and resumed repairing his fence approximately 20 yards from the gate. The patrol officers appeared confused by his reaction. They had expected arguments, frustration, or perhaps reluctant compliance. They hadn't anticipated complete indifference. Samuel had spent enough years practicing law to understand something most people never learned. When someone willingly continues making mistakes after receiving fair warning, interrupting them repeatedly becomes unnecessary. Patience often produces better results than persuasion. Nearly 45 minutes passed without further conversation. The patrol officers remained beside their vehicle, documenting imagined violations, while Samuel quietly repaired his fencing as though nothing unusual had happened. Shortly after 9 o'clock that morning, 3 luxury vehicles arrived from the neighboring development. Samuel immediately recognized 2 of them. Margaret Holloway had served as HOA president for nearly 6 years. She was remarkably talented at confusing influence with authority and had developed something of a reputation throughout the county for aggressively pursuing compliance with community standards. If something couldn't be controlled through persuasion, Margaret generally attempted accomplishing it through pressure instead. Beside her walked Richard Collins, a wealthy real estate investor who owned multiple properties throughout the community and had unsuccessfully attempted purchasing portions of Willow Creek Ranch 3 separate times over the previous decade. Samuel remembered every conversation they had ever shared. Richard had once suggested that preserving family traditions represented an irresponsible financial decision when millions of dollars were involved. Samuel politely reminded him that not everything valuable could be measured by market prices. Apparently, Richard remained unconvinced. Several additional board members accompanied them toward the southern entrance wearing expressions suggesting they anticipated victory rather than conversation. Margaret immediately began surveying the area approvingly while speaking with the patrol officers. The temporary restriction sign remained prominently displayed beside Samuel's gate exactly where they had placed it earlier that morning. No one appeared remotely concerned about standing upon private property without permission. Samuel quietly observed the interaction while continuing his repairs. Eventually, Margaret approached him carrying several documents tucked neatly beneath one arm. Her expression combined practiced professionalism with unmistakable condescension. She explained that neighboring residents had experienced increasing difficulties resulting from activities occurring near community boundaries. Traffic concerns, aesthetic considerations, environmental impacts, and long-term development planning had collectively created circumstances requiring immediate attention. Samuel listened patiently. She continued explaining that the HOA board had recently voted to establish expanded oversight initiatives, protecting homeowner investments throughout adjacent areas. The phrase expanded oversight initiatives sounded impressive until one remembered that private organizations cannot simply vote themselves authority over someone else's property. Samuel politely asked whether anyone involved in this initiative had consulted county property records before implementing their decision. Margaret confidently assured him they had conducted extensive reviews through legal advisors representing community interests. That response interested Samuel considerably. Legal advisors. Plural. Someone was billing significant hours to create this misunderstanding. Richard eventually joined the conversation, once again suggesting that cooperation represented everyone's best interests. He mentioned several development opportunities that could substantially benefit both Samuel and neighboring homeowners if appropriate agreements could finally be reached. For the first time that morning, Samuel understood precisely what motivated these extraordinary circumstances. This had never been about traffic concerns or community standards. This was about leverage. Someone had concluded that persistent pressure might eventually accomplish what generous financial offers could not. If Samuel couldn't be persuaded to sell voluntarily, perhaps becoming increasingly uncomfortable as neighboring development expanded would encourage reconsideration. The strategy might have succeeded against someone unfamiliar with property rights and legal procedures. Unfortunately for them, Willow Creek Ranch belonged to Samuel Harper. He calmly informed everyone present that their actions represented multiple violations of both civil and criminal statutes. He further explained that his warnings earlier that morning provided documented notice regarding their trespassing status moving forward. Margaret smiled politely before suggesting that legal matters could certainly be discussed appropriately if necessary. Samuel simply nodded. Legal matters would indeed be discussed appropriately. At precisely that moment, 2 county sheriff's department vehicles turned onto the gravel road leading toward the southern entrance. The expressions upon everyone's faces changed immediately. The patrol officers straightened uncomfortably beside their SUV, while several HOA representatives exchanged increasingly concerned glances. Margaret attempted maintaining her professional composure despite obvious confusion regarding the deputy's unexpected arrival. Samuel quietly returned his tools to their box and stood patiently beside the fence he had finally finished repairing. He recognized both deputies stepping from their vehicles. After practicing property law throughout the county for 4 decades, Samuel had developed professional relationships with judges, sheriffs, surveyors, and attorneys spanning multiple generations. Retirement had changed his occupation, but remarkably little else. The senior deputy smiled warmly upon seeing Samuel before formally beginning his investigation regarding reported trespassing and unauthorized restriction of access upon private property. Margaret immediately attempted explaining the HOA's position concerning community oversight responsibilities and adjacent property considerations. The deputy listened politely before asking a remarkably simple question. Who owned Willow Creek Ranch? Silence followed. The answer suddenly seemed considerably more important than anyone had previously considered. What none of the HOA representatives knew was that Samuel's second phone call earlier that morning hadn't been placed to law enforcement. It had been placed to someone reviewing 70 years of property records, survey maps, recorded easements, and documentation regarding several previously forgotten agreements affecting portions of the neighboring development itself. Because boundaries work both directions. And before this situation ended, the people attempting to control Samuel's property were about to discover that Willow Creek Ranch possessed rights they had completely overlooked. Rights worth far more than they could possibly imagine. The silence that settled over the southern entrance of Willow Creek Ranch that morning felt very different from the peaceful silence Samuel Harper had enjoyed for decades. This silence carried realization. For the first time since arriving at the property, the HOA representatives no longer appeared confident. The authority they had displayed only moments earlier was slowly being replaced by uncertainty. Reality had finally entered the conversation. The senior deputy patiently reviewed the documentation Samuel provided regarding ownership of Willow Creek Ranch. Every acre was clearly recorded, every boundary professionally surveyed, and every easement legally protected. There was no ambiguity regarding who possessed authority over the property. It belonged entirely to Samuel Harper. The temporary restriction sign standing beside the gate suddenly appeared far less impressive than it had earlier that morning. What Margaret Holloway had believed to be an administrative matter involving community concerns had transformed into something considerably more serious. Private security personnel had physically obstructed access to privately owned land without legal authorization, while acting upon instructions provided by individuals who possessed absolutely no jurisdiction over that property. The situation was no longer hypothetical. It was documented. The deputies requested identification from everyone involved and began formally recording statements regarding the morning's events. What had started as an exercise in intimidation was quickly becoming an investigation. Margaret attempted explaining that the HOA had acted in good faith while addressing legitimate homeowner concerns. Richard Collins insisted there must simply have been misunderstandings regarding property boundaries and community interests. Samuel quietly listened, without interruption. He had heard similar explanations throughout his legal career. People frequently described their actions as misunderstandings only after discovering those actions carried consequences. Intentions mattered. Actions mattered more. The fake patrol officers received immediate instructions removing all unauthorized signage and relocating their vehicle away from Samuel's entrance. Their confidence from earlier that morning had completely disappeared. No one seemed interested in discussing expanded oversight initiatives any longer. For Samuel, however, the matter wasn't finished. He had spent decades teaching younger attorneys that legal disputes rarely existed in isolation. When someone became willing to violate one boundary, there was usually another boundary violated somewhere else. That lesson had proven remarkably reliable throughout his career. By early afternoon, Samuel received the information he had been waiting for from the county record's office. After reviewing historical property documents dating back nearly 70 years, an interesting discovery emerged regarding Willow Creek Ranch and the neighboring development. 38 years earlier, Samuel's father had negotiated several recorded easement agreements benefiting portions of what would eventually become the luxury community. Those agreements permitted underground utility access and emergency vehicle routes, crossing designated sections of the ranch whenever necessary. At the time, the agreements were established specifically to preserve future development opportunities throughout the surrounding area while protecting the Harper family's ownership rights. Most importantly, the agreements contained several conditions. Any intentional interference with the Harper family's lawful access and enjoyment of their property constituted material violations, subject to immediate legal review and potential termination proceedings. For decades, the agreements had functioned quietly in the background without issue. No one paid attention to them because there had never been any reason to do so. Until now. If successfully challenged in court, portions of the neighboring development would potentially require extraordinarily expensive infrastructure modifications involving roads, utilities, and emergency access planning. The estimated costs reached several $1,000,000. Samuel smiled quietly as he finished reviewing the documents. Life possessed a remarkable sense of irony sometimes. The people attempting to inconvenience an elderly ranch owner had unknowingly jeopardized the interests of hundreds of homeowners throughout their own community. They had picked the wrong property. More importantly, they had picked the wrong landowner. Several days later, attorneys representing the HOA formally requested an emergency meeting with Samuel. The tone of their correspondence differed substantially from the confidence displayed at Willow Creek Ranch earlier that week. Words like cooperation, resolution, and mutual understanding appeared repeatedly throughout their communications. Samuel accepted the meeting, not because he was interested in revenge, but because he believed consequences should teach lessons rather than simply create suffering. The conference room remained unusually quiet as attorneys, board members, and community representatives gathered around an oversized table, overlooking the very development they had once attempted controlling. Margaret Holloway appeared exhausted. Richard Collins looked considerably less confident than he had only days earlier. Neither seemed interested in discussing community oversight policies anymore. Samuel patiently listened while attorneys explained the HOA's willingness to immediately resolve all outstanding concerns. Formal apologies would be issued. The fake patrol service had already been terminated. New policies preventing similar incidents would be implemented immediately. Financial settlements were quietly mentioned as possibilities if necessary. Samuel appreciated their efforts. Then he shared something none of them expected. He wasn't interested in money. The room became noticeably quieter. Samuel explained that Willow Creek Ranch had survived 70 years because previous generations understood an important truth. Land wasn't merely property. It represented responsibility. Communities flourished when neighbors respected one another's boundaries rather than attempting controlling them. He had never opposed the neighboring development. He had never objected to people building homes and raising families beside his ranch. His only expectation had always been mutual respect. What troubled him wasn't their mistake. It was their assumption. They saw an elderly man driving an old truck and assumed he lacked resources. They saw weathered clothing and imagined weakness. They saw peaceful silence and mistook it for surrender. They never considered asking who he was before deciding what he deserved. Samuel informed them he would not pursue every legal remedy available to him, provided several conditions were met. First, every homeowner within the community would receive complete disclosure regarding the incident and the actions undertaken without their knowledge. Second, mandatory legal and ethics training would become required for all future HOA board members regarding property rights and limitations of community authority. Third, the HOA would establish a scholarship fund supporting local agricultural students in honor of Samuel's late father, recognizing the farming families who had shaped the county long before luxury developments arrived. Finally, the neighboring community would permanently dedicate a protected green space bordering Willow Creek Ranch, acknowledging its historical significance. There was no punishment hidden within his requests, only lessons. The proposals were unanimously accepted. Months later, life at Willow Creek Ranch returned to normal. Samuel once again spent his mornings repairing fences, tending gardens, and watching sunlight rise over land his family had protected for generations. Something had changed, however. Neighbors who once viewed the ranch merely as undeveloped real estate now understood its history. Children visited during educational programs, teaching agricultural traditions and property stewardship. Relationships between the community and the Harper family gradually transformed into something far healthier than either side previously imagined. Margaret Holloway quietly resigned from the HOA board several weeks after the incident. Richard Collins publicly apologized during a community meeting before becoming one of the scholarship fund's largest contributors. Perhaps consequences had taught their intended lessons after all. As for the temporary sign declaring private community access restrictions, Samuel eventually kept it stored inside his barn. Not as a trophy, not as a reminder of victory, but as a reminder that appearances often conceal truths people never bother discovering. Because some fences exist to separate neighbors, others exist to teach them respect. And sometimes, the greatest mistake arrogance can make is assuming a quiet man, standing beside an old wooden gate, has nothing left to teach the world. After all, they had been warned to leave. They simply refused. And they picked the wrong landowner.